my name is Caitlin Cross Harris, and I want to welcome you to Gender Bias and Historical Narratives. This is part two of our 2025 Virtual Educators Workshop. What you're watching is an asynchronous version of our live event on July 16th, which means there will be moments that ask for participation. But don't worry, I'll walk you through how you can do this at home. We at the museum do encourage you to register for our future events by signing up to our newsletter to keep you in the know and by keeping up to date with what we are doing here at the museum. On the screen now is a QR code that will take you to our pre-assessment for the first workshop. And even though this isn't a live event, we would still love if you would take the time to complete it. Both the pre-assessment and the post-assessment not only allow us here at the museum to see how we've helped you grow, but also gives us a chance to help grow in the future because the feedback that you provide in the workshop helps us to continue to create workshops that cater to teachers across the country. I want to give you a quick overview of what you can expect to take away from this workshop. First and foremost, you'll gain confidence weaving diverse women's stories into your curriculum. Second, you'll learn to spot and explain gender bias within the usual historical narratives. And finally, you'll be able to find top quality women's history resources like primary documents, scholarly articles, and ready to use lesson plans to enhance your own lessons. A bit about myself. I am a social studies educator, and I wanted to share with you an aha moment that I had with my students. The pictures of my high school students, mostly freshmen, in my American government class. The students had asked me almost nonstop about the rumored TikTok ban. I, in turn, asked them why they cared so much about a social media app being banned, and the answer across the board hit on themes like being connected to people around the country and the world. And research also tells us that TikTok is how a majority of our students receive their news. So I decided to break the mold. When the Senate was live with the committee interrogating the owner of TikTok, I put it on. I was not prepared for the level of engagement that they put into it, and students were looking up the names of senators, they were asking questions, and most importantly, they wanted to know how to get involved. But why did I share this? So, because education as we know it today can feel out of touch for our students, it's no wonder that they disengage with what's going on in our classrooms. We need to break the mold so that the history our students receive is one that they can connect to. We begin that work today by breaking the mold of gender bias within historical narratives. So before moving forward with the rest of the presentation, we get into the content for this session. It's important to ensure that we have a common vocabulary. So first on the list is gender bias. This is placing a greater importance on one gender within language, representation, and historical narratives. Second is intersectionality. So this is a framework for understanding how gender intersects with race, class, sexuality, and other identities. Next, we have erasure. So this is the act of omitting or downplaying the contributions of marginalized groups in historical accounts. And then finally, we have counter narrative. This is an interpretation of history that challenges the dominant or mainstream accounts of an event or time period. So these words are going to lay a foundation for us throughout the workshop so that we can all be on the same page. And now that we've done that, I'd like to walk everyone through the agenda for today's webinar. First, we're going to do a warm-up of sorts, and then we are going to begin our first learning segment where we're going to discuss silences in the archives, if you will, and we're going to talk about how this impacts the historical narratives. Then there's a moment where you can pause and take a break. And then after that, we're going to discuss best practices for pluralistic teaching to bring in women's voices into our curriculum. And finally, we're going to wrap up what we've learned with our second application session, wherein we'll collaboratively work to fill the silence in the curriculum. All right, so as I mentioned before, there is an application session. So here, this is going to be a Canva link to a totally anonymized textbook source, and you can either look it up yourself or you can take a moment within your own resources that you have and analyze some textbook sources that you have. But I would love for you to take this moment and to analyze it to see where you see moments of history erasure or where you see gender bias. Now that you've looked at a textbook sample, be it our own or one that you have handy, it leads us to ask the question, where are our stories? Now, the our in this question can be and is incredibly nuanced, right? However, the scope of today's webinar is focusing on women within historical narratives. So, to help us think more narrowly, we can ask the questions: how does historical narratives with gender bias impact our curriculum? And then, how can we identify a gender bias within our curriculum resources? But most importantly, what does this mean for our students? Today, we're going to explore these questions so that we may begin to create and work towards a curriculum for our students that is reflective of their needs, their communities, and their world. So, in the next few slides, we're going to talk through gender bias, through the use of primary sources, and how we can use them in our classrooms to combat gender bias. Now, here's a moment where you can reflect on this question or pause and turn and talk to your neighbors. So, I want you to think about when I say trusted primary source or sources, what comes to mind? So, just pause a second and think about that. Now, when I talk about the teaching of history, usually the first go to is primary sources, and in most cases, that is the right response. However, we know that who gets to record their history and which account of history is remembered is incredibly layered. This means that women are oftentimes left out of the historical narrative completely because our public facing sources, such as newspapers or photographs, are typically going to be taken or produced by men. And thereby, there is an inherent gendered lens through which we see into the past, ergo, our missing stories. So, there's also the intention behind the creation of primary sources. A connection we can make is thinking of social media today. Behind many social media posts, there is the intention to evoke some kind of emotion from the viewer. As such, we have to consider ways in which a primary source could potentially guide us to a certain thought or conclusion without even realizing it. So, the next few slides, we're going to evaluate some primary sources together to explore gender bias within those historical narratives. So, starting us off with some sports history, I would love if you guys would pause a moment to reflect on this source. So, this source is from the 1959 Boston Marathon. I want you to ask the question or describe what you see and think about why this image was taken. So, please feel free to pause right now to do so. We have to talk about women who are missing from the greater narrative and their actions to overcome barriers. So the first Boston Marathon was in 1897, and spoiler alert, women were not allowed to run. However, we have a couple of trailblazers that were overlooked. First, we have Roberta Bobby Gibb, and in 1956, she applied to run in the Boston Marathon and was rejected, being told that, quote, women are not physiologically able to run a marathon and we can't take on the liability. So this obstacle didn't deter her, and instead of accepting their rejection, she hid in the bushes, wearing a swimsuit and her brother's cargo shorts and his tennis shoes because women's athletic equipment wasn't really a thing. And next we have Catherine Schweitzer. And in 1967, she made history as the first woman to, air quotes, officially run in the Boston Marathon because she hid her name when she registered. Schweitzer registered as K.V. Schweitzer. And once officials and fellow racers began to realize that a woman was running, they began to forcefully remove her. Despite their violence, she finished the race with a final time of 4 hours and 20 minutes. And it would not be until 1972 that women could actually run the Boston Marathon without hiding their names. All right, so next, primary source. So look at this image, and instead of describing it, share what you think the message of this primary source is. And what I mean by that is, what kind of narrative is this primary source pushing? Please pause and do so now. Now, there are numerous men in this picture, but we do have two women present. So we have Katherine Johnson in the back, and towards the center is Joanne Morgan. So this image shows us that in addition to asking the question of who is missing in a primary source, we can confidently say it's about perspective, perspective, perspective. And in this image, they had to fight to be included in this room because at the time, women were very much still viewed as bystanders within historical events, and adding them into this picture or letting them in the room would be quote unquote bad for optics. So, really digging in with our students, how primary sources are sending a message is crucial. All right, next primary source. I'd like you to share when or what event you think is happening when this primary source was created. And also think about why they are protesting in the first place. Please pause and do so now. So, this is an image from the Great Depression, which is a time when we begin to see women entering in the workforce at incredibly high rates, to the point that there was a cultural movement evolving that women were stealing men's jobs. What we see here are women protesting the ban on hiring married women. While this was a practice since the 1880s, it reached a new height as jobs became scarce and having a single income home became incredibly more difficult. So, unmarried women were preferable to married women because they could be paid less than what was culturally expected of a married woman. And additionally, women from marginalized groups such as Black women and Latina women found their struggle to find work even more difficult than before as white women began to enter in the workforce themselves. So I bring this primary source forward to illustrate how we can teach major historical events while also including how women and members of marginalized groups experience them in different ways. So, to continue building on what we've learned so far, when it comes to using primary source and combating gender bias, we need to ask the questions: who is missing? What is this perspective, purpose, and message of this primary source? And how can we use primary sources to share how we, meaning all groups of people, experience historical events? So, our next primary source, this is a political cartoon. And before I reveal too much about it, I'd love for you to share what story you think is being told here. And you probably have guessed it by now, but the question is, what is the story? Just pause and think about that for a moment. So, I'm using a zoom in method here, but another detail I want to reveal is to turn your attention to the black and white box being held by the butler. I know it's blurry because I've blown it up, but the label on the box says ballots. So using the same question as before, how does that alter your perspective of the story being told? So now our last detail I want to share about this political cartoon is the title. So this piece is called Making the Polls Attractive to the Anti-Suffragists, and it's by Ralph Barton. While we often talk about the suffrage movement as being woman-centric, there is also many layers to consider within the movement itself. And so here, while the movement was promoting the independence of women, this cartoon depicts the anti-suffragists with the subtle message that women at the time were of frivolity and indulgence. So again, we have to ask ourselves, what story is being told when we use our primary sources? And when working with primary sources, we often treat them as facts, but they are really, really about perspectives. And to understand them fully, we have to ask those questions: who created this? Who's being represented or left out? And how does gender shape what we see or don't see? So, in the case of Rosalind Franklin, for example, she was a chemist whose X ray images of DNA were crucial to the discovery of the double helix. But in her original scientific papers and award announcements, her contributions were minimalized or left out entirely, even though her data made the breakthrough possible. If we relied on those primary sources, we'd think that the story of DNA belonged to solely Watson and Crick, and that's the impact of gender bias, not just in what's written, but in whose work gets recognized. And it reminds us that history just isn't about what happened, it's also about who got credit. So, primary sources can be powerful teaching tools, but we have to guide students to ask what's missing and whose version of history is this? So, as we've seen so far, gender bias within our historical narratives can be loud and obvious, but they can also be subtle. In the sources that do not have women in them, sources that push women to the margins, and then the sources that spin a narrative that subvert the reality of all people at the time. So, historically, women have been underrepresented in textbooks and state standards, and when mentioned, they're often limited to roles such as figures of moral virtues, oftentimes depicting fictional women, such as Rosie the Riveter here. And then we also have figures of support or completely erased, such as the work of Alice Paul, whose discovery gifted the world with the cure of leprosy, and it was stolen from her. The imbalance here communicates a dangerous message that history is written by those in power. For students, especially those from marginalized groups, this can lead to a sense of detachment from the past. And by that, I mean students who do not see themselves within history and in turn do not engage in the teaching of it. And honestly, can we blame them? So, as I mentioned briefly before in our first workshop in June, curriculum work is also identity work. And education research consistently shows that the content of our curriculum shapes our students' academic engagement and perceptions. So, when historical narratives marginalize or exclude women, it has educational consequences, such as lack of civic engagement. A study revealed that not only do students disengage with the lesson when they don't see themselves, it also impacts their perception of belonging within the democratic process, meaning they are less likely to participate in civic engagement actions such as protesting. There's also the risk of lack of diverse perspectives in our curriculum hindering critical thinking, meaning that students who are not provided the opportunity to identify biases within history miss a chance to develop that higher order thinking skills, such as source evaluation, contextual analysis, and historical empathy. So, while being intentional and aware of gender bias within our content and curriculum is critical, the structure of how we teach history is just as important. The past and most common structure for teaching history prioritize military conflicts and economic developments with a few social movements sprinkled in, which means, unfortunately, women's history is often taught in passing at best and tokenistic at worst. By teaching women's history like it's a box to be checked and then move on. So, shameless plug, if you haven't already watched the first workshop, it does address this issue. But the structure inherently marginalizes women because it is a gender bias that limits an understanding of history as a collection of cause and effect, push and pull, but this is often sparked by social movements in our country's history. So, we've gone through a good bit of information that has hopefully sparked curiosity, but also bringing inspiration for what you can bring back to your classroom, which leads us to our next learning session when we get back from this break. So when we get back, we're going to start covering the favorite part of my workshops or our workshops is to understand how we can make this happen in the classroom. So take a moment, recharge, and I will see you back. So while we are coming back together, it's good to start off with intention, and I would like you to just reflect what your favorite thing you have learned so far in this workshop is. It's just a great way to put our minds back in this headspace and be excited about the work that we're doing here. And I want to refer us back to our agenda just to make sure that we're all aware of the roadmap that we're taking here. So we analyzed a textbook sample. We've gone through the process of asking questions about our primary sources and how they can intentionally or unintentionally perpetuate gender bias. And now that we're done with our break, we're going to talk about real classroom moments that we can add this into our curriculum with. So, today, we're going to use three different frameworks to combat gender bias within historical narratives, be it textbooks, supplemental materials, or primary sources. And the three frameworks that we're going to focus on will be the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework from NCSS, otherwise known as the C3 Framework from the National Council of the Social Studies. Next up is inquiry-based learning, pedagogy style for building lesson plans. And then finally, we're going to look at historical empathy as a pedagogical tool for asking students to lean into history beyond the facts. So in order, we're going to talk about the C3 framework. So this may be a refresher for some, but we're going to be looking at using the C3 framework as a foundation for uncovering gender bias. So the C3 framework is a powerful tool for building inquiry-based social studies lessons, and it's designed to promote critical thinking, civic engagement, and disciplinary literacy. So the C3 framework is organized into four key dimensions that guide students through the process of asking meaningful questions, analyzing evidence, and taking informed action. So when used intentionally, each dimension can support lessons that not only teach about women's history, but actively confront and unpack gender bias embedded in traditional historical narratives. So dimension one, this is the portion that asks the teacher to create a compelling question, and the compelling question can be as simple as, but it needs to speak or spark curiosity within your students to explore history. So a few broad questions can look like, why are so few women mentioned in our textbook? Or whose stories are missing from this timeline? Second dimension, this is applying disciplinary tools and concepts. This is where students use the discipline skills from civic, geography, or history, and here students begin to explore how sources reflect power structures and analyze the framing of events. So, who is centered, who is left out, and students also examine the social, political, and cultural conditions that have historically shaped gender roles. Next up is dimension three. So this is evaluating sources and using evidence. Students engage with primary sources created by women, diaries, letters, protest signs, speeches, artwork, and they can compare these with textbook narratives or mainstream secondary sources to identify omissions or misinterpretations. So this helps them to see how historical narratives are constructed and how women's voices have been excluded or minimized. And then finally, dimension four, which is my personal favorite. This asks students to synthesize their findings through writing, presentations, or creative projects. And they might create a new exhibit panel, write a more inclusive textbook entry, or advocate for curriculum changes. So the goal is for students to not only learn history, but participate in reshaping how history is told by taking that informed action from what they've learned. All right, next up we have inquiry-based learning, and this shifts the classroom from passive absorption of facts to active investigation. So instead of presenting history as a set of fixed narratives, inquiry-based learning invites students to ask questions, analyze evidence, and draw their own conclusions. It emphasizes curiosity, critical thinking, and student agency, helping learners become historians rather than just consumers of history. This approach is especially powerful when teaching women's history, because rather than simply inserting a few notable women into the existing curriculum, inquiry based learning allows students to investigate why women have been left out of the dominant narratives in the first place and what tells us about historical power structure. Now, for example, a lesson might begin with a provocative question like, why do we know so much about certain historical figures and so little about women who lived during the same time? So from there, students explore primary and secondary sources to identify gaps and silences in the record and explain how gender has shaped what is remembered and what is forgotten. So, inquiry based learning also encourages students to explore intersectionality, so how race, class, and other factors intersect with gender bias within those historical narratives. And so, as they build their investigations, students engage with diverse perspectives and begin to challenge assumptions embedded within the curriculum itself. In the end, students don't just learn about women's history, they uncover it. They become co creators of knowledge, learning to ask difficult questions, amplify marginalized voices, and think critically about whose stories are told and why. Next is historical empathy. So, this is the ability to understand the thoughts, feelings, and motivations and context of people in the past without judging them by today's standards. So, it's really great at fighting presentism. It's not about agreeing with historical actors, but about deeply considering their lived realities and the constraints that they faced. So, the skill is essential for teaching inclusive, critical history because it pushes students to move beyond stereotypes, one dimensional heroes or villain narratives, and instead ask, what was it like to live in this moment, in this place, and under these conditions? So, when applied to women's history, historical empathy opens a powerful amount of possibilities. So, instead of simply memorizing a few key figures like Susan B. Anthony or Sojourner Truth, students explore the broader experiences of women across class, race, geography, and time, and they might read personal letters, examine oral histories, or analyze photographs, sources that illuminate daily life, resistance, and resilience. So, historical empathy also helps students to interrogate why women were excluded from dominant narratives. It allows them to understand how gender roles, societal expectations, and systems of power shaped whose stories were recorded, preserved, or even erased. And so, by using historical empathy in our lesson design, we don't just add women in, we help students connect emotionally and intellectually with women whose experiences in history are so nuanced. And this deepens critical thinking, it builds compassion, and it equips students to challenge gender bias in the past and how history is taught today. So now we're going to go through a couple of cases of where we can use these three frameworks, starting off with Frida Kahlo. So she was a Mexican painter whose deeply personal and symbolic artwork made her an icon of feminism, resilience, and cultural pride. Frida Kahlo survived a near fatal bus accident at the age of 18 that left her with a lifelong pain and medical complications, and an experience that shaped much of her artistic identity. While she is often associated with surrealism, Kahlo rejected that label, asserting that she painted her own reality. Her work, often self portraits, explored themes of identity, gender, disability, colonialism, and personal suffering. Today, Kahlo is celebrated not only for her groundbreaking artwork, but also for her unapologetic embrace of indigenous Mexican culture, her defiance of gender norms, and her role as a trailblazer in both art and activism. So, how can we use our three frameworks here? So, the C3 framework, students can frame questions about how her identity as a woman and a Mexican artist and a person with disabilities shaped her reception and legacy. And using inquiry, they can analyze why her art was once marginalized and how it has been reinterpreted over time. And then finally, with historical empathy, students can examine her self portraits not only as artworks, but as deeply personal acts of agency in a male dominated Eurocentric art world. So when students learn to analyze, question, and empathize all at once, they build a version of historical understanding that is inclusive, critical, and reflective in preparing them to uncover bias, to honor complexity, and to take ownership of history as living inquiry. So these approaches help students see history as a dynamic field, one that has often excluded women who fought for the intersections of multiple identities. So the C3 framework gives structure to that exploration with its four dimensions, guiding students through the questioning, the analysis, evidence gathering, and civic action. So inquiry-based learning, again, activates that student curiosity. So instead of teaching disability rights through a single policy or date, start with questions like, why do so few history books include leaders of the disability rights movement? So this line of inquiry invites students to confront the historical marginalization of women like Judith Heumann, whose activism shaped national and global policy. So, historical empathy then deepens the inquiry because students explore what it meant to be a disabled woman in the mid 20th century in America, which would bar her from school, work, and public life. And empathy allows students to understand the courage it took for Heumann to sue the New York Board of Education in the 1970s or to help organize the 504 sit in, which was the longest nonviolent occupation of a federal building in U.S. history. So, again, more narrowly, with the C3 framework, students might ask the specific question: how did Judith Heumann's gender and disability impact how she was viewed as a leader? Through inquiry based learning, they investigate how her contributions were received by the media, the government, and even within the activist community itself. And then finally, historical empathy. They can analyze her speeches, interviews, and memoir to better understand her motives, sacrifices, and her legacy. So, again, by combining all of these tools, students don't just study disability rights or women's history in isolation, they examine how systems of exclusion operate across multiple dimensions and how women like Heumann fought back. These lessons show students how to question the dominant narratives, recognize injustice, and see activism as a form of historical authorship. Now, what I would like to do is to bring these three frameworks together for you to practice.
A very serious moment in our history.
Only this time we're going to write out, or you can talk with your neighbor if you are viewing this with a group, how we can apply these three frameworks, again, inquiry-based learning, historical empathy, and the C3 framework to this specific primary source. So what I'm about to play is a radio broadcast from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt following the attack on Pearl Harbor. I want you to think about how we could teach Pearl Harbor using this primary source, bringing in gender bias and women's history all in the same go.
Meantime, we, the people, are already prepared for action. For months now, the knowledge that something of this kind might happen has been hanging over our heads, and yet it seemed impossible to believe, impossible to drop the everyday things of life and feel that there was only one thing which was important: preparation to meet an enemy, no matter where he struck. That is all over now, and there is no more uncertainty. We know what we have to face, and we know that we are ready to face it. I should like to say just a word to the women in the country tonight. I have a boy at sea on a destroyer. For all I know, he may be on his way to the Pacific. 2 of my children are in coast cities on the Pacific. Many of you all over this country have boys in the services who will now be called upon to go into action. You have friends and families in what has suddenly become a danger zone. You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears. We must go about our daily business more determined than ever to do the ordinary things as well as we can. And when we find a way to do anything more in our communities, to help others, to build morale, to give a feeling of security, we must do it. Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America. To the young people of the nation, I must speak a word tonight. You are going to have a great opportunity. There will be high moments in which your strength and your ability will be tested. I have faith in you. I feel as though I was standing upon a rock, and that rock is my faith in my fellow citizens. Now we will go back to the program which we had arranged for tonight. I'm speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The Cabinet is convening, and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the President. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the President all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the President at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines and sinking one of our transports loaded with lumber on its way to Hawaii. By tomorrow morning, the members of Congress will have a full report and be ready for action. In the meantime, we, the people, are already prepared for action. For months now, the knowledge that something of
So
this
really
kind
cool
might
primary
happen
source,
has
right?
been hanging
But
over our
pause
heads.
and
And yet,
again
it
try to
seems
use the
impossible
C3
to
framework,
believe,
inquiry
impossible to
based
drop
learning,
the
and
everyday things
historical
of life
empathy. Determine
and
how
feel
you
that
can
there
use
was
this
only
primary
one
source
thing
to
which
teach
was
Pearl
important:
Harbor while also
preparation
bringing
to
in
meet an
women's
enemy, no
history
matter
and
where he
gender
struck.
bias at the same time.
That is all over now, and there is no more uncertainty. We know what we have to face, and we know that we are ready to face it.
Now, for the second application session, this is one moment where I would really like for you to think about different eras in American history and draw a chart with one column being historical empathy, one column being inquiry based learning, one column for your standard, and then one column for a woman in history. So, laying out this grid can help us to visualize how we can bring in these three frameworks, how we can bring in women's history, and how we can combat gender bias in a very, very approachable way. So, please again, feel free to pause and work on that together or independently if you're watching this alone. All right, before we begin wrapping up, I want to recap everything that we've talked about today. So, we explored primary sources and how we can use them to tell the story of everyone by asking who is missing, what is the perspective, how does this conflict affect everyone, and what story is being told. And then we discussed what tools we can use to overthrow gender bias in our historical narratives. The C3 framework as the foundation of building our lessons. Then we talked about inquiry based learning to invite our students to think like historians and investigate history rather than being told what to think, see, or believe. And then finally, historical empathy brings our students in to think about the human element of history by asking them to think about how people felt, what cultural nuances led them to consider their decisions or beliefs. And then, in combination of all of these tools, we can truly begin to do the work of bringing history to life for our students and making it relevant so that they see themselves in the historical narrative of our country. Finally, I want to turn your attention to some of the sources that we have here at the National Women's History Museum. The first being the biographies. So these features detailed profiles of influential women across US history. They are searchable by time period, theme, or topic, and these are great for student research. There's even sections at the bottom of each biography for warm-ups. There's also timeline of activities that you can use here. They are really, really great sources. Next up is virtual field trips. These are hosted by myself, and the interactive virtual experiences explore key women's history topics and includes educator guides and reflection questions, along with a packet of activities that students can do alongside the exploration of the primary sources. And so this is ideal for synchronous classroom use, and those are reserved on our website on the link that you see above. Next up is lesson plans. So these are ready to use lesson plans on women's history topics created by our For Educators by Educator cohort members. So this is a cohort of teachers who are currently serving in the classroom that help curate and create lesson plans to be used. Next up, we want them to include primary sources, inquiry based learning, and activities that are accessible for students across the country. They are organized by grade level and by subject area too. Finally, or next to last, we have National History Day Aid, which we provide support materials for students and teachers participating in National History Day. This features topic ideas, research tips, and recommended resources. We also highlight women's stories that connect with the annual theme as well. Now, finally, we have the Affiliate Bookshop. So, this is a curated collection of books on women's history for all ages. It supports independent bookstores and the museum's mission as well. And it's useful for building a classroom or school library with inclusive text. So, again, as I mentioned before, this is an asynchronous presentation, of course, but that does not mean that we don't want your feedback. So, the QR code that you see on the screen right now is still a live post assessment. So, remember, please do the pre assessment and please do the post assessment. It helps us to grow and it helps guide our thinking for future workshops as well. So, please pause, scan that QR code, and complete that post assessment. It helps us. But I want to thank you all so much for being present and contributing to being a part of adding women's history into classrooms. But if you missed some notes or points, please don't worry. You can always have access to this video. It will be housed on our website for the foreseeable future. And I want to turn your attention to, again, signing up for our newsletter so that you can be up to date with any future workshops that we do, along with any future events as well. One of which will be Brave Girls Story Hour in October. So please tune in and register for that. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope that it was incredibly useful.